Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining from today. Thank you for joining our weekly live stream that we do every Tuesday at the same time, same place, same platform that you're listening or watching here today. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting, and we're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys. We help them with software selection, digital strategy, as well as implementation planning and the implementation itself. I'm so glad to be here today. Today's topic is lessons from multinational digital transformations and ERP projects. So we're going to really dive into what makes a global, multinational, international digital transformation different and what some of those nuances are of multinational implementations compared to a normal transformation, if there is such a thing as a normal transformation. So we're going to dive into that here today with our two guests. I'm going to introduce our guests here in just a moment, but before I introduce our guests, just a couple of housekeeping items. One is this is a live interview format, so we are streaming live to LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. So wherever you're listening or watching here today, we are watching the chat and we are going to take audience questions. So we'd love to hear any questions you have for us here today. We'd love to hear from you. Secondly, this podcast is part of our weekly Transformation Ground Control podcast. So we're doing this live. We're going to edit it, add some more content to it. Then it'll become part of our polished final episode of Transformation Ground Control. And you can see all the past episodes of that show by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. And at transformationgroundcontrol.com, you can see all the places and platforms that you can listen and watch to the podcast. So that's a little bit of background. Real quickly, before I introduce our guests, I'd love to hear from the audience, though, in using the chat in your stream, wherever you're listening or watching here today. If you don't mind, just drop in the chat where in the world you're joining from, since this is a global topic, and typically we draw a global audience. I'd love to hear from the audience where you're joining from. So if you don't mind, just drop in the chat what city and country you're joining from today. That'll just help us have some fun here to see where everyone is joining from here today on the various platforms. So while you're answering that question of where you're joining from today, I want to introduce our two guests. I have two guests here today from Third Stage Consulting to help us unpack this topic of multinational digital transformations. We have Dean Sam, who is the Vice President of our Asia Pacific region here at Third Stage, and Aaron Patterson, who's the Executive Vice President of our EMEA, Europe, Middle East, and Africa region here at Third Stage. So glad to have you both here, and I'm going to ask you to introduce yourselves, but we'll start with you, Dean. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks, Eric. Hi, Aaron. Well, just wanted to thank our viewers who are watching or listening us. It's great to have an opportunity just to share our experiences and sort of our know-how in the space of digital transformation. Hopefully, we can clarify certain things, untackle certain mysteries of digital transformation, because in our view, it's not that complicated. But just about myself, I'm based out of Hong Kong. I've been in the digital transformation, ERP implementation, as well as HRM, CRM engagements, and in the consulting field for the last 15 years. I've worked in several different countries, such as Canada, Bangladesh, China, and Hong Kong. And as I'm looking after the APAC region, we also have quite a bit of clients in the Australia and New Zealand region as well. So looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, great having you here today. And then Aaron, you're joining us representing the EMEA region, but tell us a little bit about your background and what you do at Third Stage.
Thanks, Eric. Yeah, my background, straight from college, actually, I was involved in large SI projects and some multinational ones. I was actually a software developer for the longest time, and then gradually worked my way through a number of different roles, working on large projects, doing either system integration or consulting throughout my career. And luckily enough, as Eric knows, we actually got to work together on an international project back in the late 1990s, I think it was, or early 2000s, down in South Africa, and we had a lot of fun down there. So always been involved in lots of different projects in lots of different countries, really enjoyed it. And if anybody's actually met me in real life, you know how much I enjoy talking about large projects and how to make them successful and some of the mistakes that we've all gone through. So looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, likewise. Good to have you both here. And that is an interesting tie here or connection to this topic here today is Aaron and I, had the first project we worked on together was actually in Johannesburg or in South Africa, throughout South Africa, working on a project down there. So it's only fitting that we would have this topic here today. And speaking of South Africa, we have just kind of turning to the audience and where people are joining from today. We have several people that have chimed in on where they're joining from. Alcinda, coincidentally, is joining us from Johannesburg, South Africa on LinkedIn. So thanks for being here again, Alcinda. Dan's joining from Reston, Virginia. Derek from Chicago. Craig from Hereford, UK. Pamela from Connecticut. Sid from New Jersey. Patrick from Ireland. And Kay Trivovel joining from Ghana, West Africa. So we've got people joining from all over the world here today, as we typically do, but even more appropriate, more fitting here today that we'd have people throughout the world to give them the topic here today. So I guess just to start and really just to kind of get into the conversation here, and maybe here I'll start with you, Dean, on this question. But so digital transformations are difficult. I think we can all agree on that. Digital transformations are maybe not complex or don't need to be complicated, like you said, Dean, but they are difficult for a lot of organizations. But what makes multinational implementations even more difficult than a typical, single location implementation or transformation?
Yeah, I think it's just about the scale of the project, right? Number one, if you're going through a digital transformation or system implementation in one location, that's already a program in itself, right? It's not just a project, it's a program. You got to think about different things. You got to not just the technology, but the preparation in the organization, the process reviews, the functional requirements, the data cleansing. That all has to be done internally. And then there's the change management piece. And then you add in the technology and the vendors as well. And then it escalates not the complexity, but the management level that's required to oversee all of those moving parts. So that's for one location. But now we're talking about multinational. Then we have a program in one location. We probably have to have a program for a regional location now. So combining different locations. And then probably when we're talking about global, so we probably have to have a global program to put an umbrella on top of that. So we're adding different program management levels, not just project management, but program management levels in order to get through this multinational global implementation project. So it's just the scale and the number of people that needs to be involved is quite incredible. So the team or the client needs to be equipped with solid people all around, and they need to be working on the one same song sheet, and that's what's missing, really, right? You need to have a framework. You need to have a consistent strategy from global to regional and to per location. So it's a lot of work and a lot of preparation is required. And we talk a lot about phase 0 being extremely important. This phase 0 has to be on steroids in order to get that done.
Very, very true. I mean, you've got multiple ways of operating. Typically, you have multiple operating models. You have different org structures. You have different cultures. So it's a lot of moving parts, as you put it, to pull it all together. And we'll come back to some of those. I'm going to pull on some of those threads a little bit more here in a moment. But how about you, Aaron? What would you add to the conversation here as far as what, in your opinion, what makes these multinational projects even more complex and more difficult than a single site implementation?
Yeah, I think Dean covered a lot of the good points around the actual scale and the management of that and how complex that is. I think there's a couple of things that are pretty unique to the multinational in terms of how it might impact. Some of those are cultural differences, for example, right? So you have truly different cultures across nations as opposed to just within a single organization in a single country. And that can, manifest itself in a number of different ways, even just getting a common calendar together, for example, different holidays in different countries, different times, religious holidays where work isn't done, for example. There's a number of different things that have to be taken into consideration that you wouldn't necessarily have to deal with if you were dealing in one country. The other side of that as well is really the the compliance and regulatory reporting, right? You get into a whole different ball game when all of a sudden you're doing tax returns for 80 countries instead of one, and you're trying to pull financial information in a consistent way, when the organizations that are actually in control of licensing you or authorizing you to work in different countries, you have to deal with a lot more complexity, and a lot of times it's very localized as well, right? It's not something that can be laid down from the top and standardized right the way across the organization. So those are probably two of the things that you always run into in terms of multinational that I've found and need to be addressed in a controlled and organized fashion.
Yeah. And you both have alluded to this concept of culture, as far as just the different, not only the geographic cultures, so operating in different countries on its own has different cultures because of the people in those countries, but you also have your own unique cultural differences just within the organization, across locations. So what are some of and I'll start with you on this one, Aaron, but what are some of the common cultural and organizational challenges that are faced during transformations that involve multiple countries? Do you have any examples or examples of types of things that are challenging from a cultural perspective on multinational implementations?
I think really there's probably a couple of things. I don't think, there's resistance to change in general. And I think as a multinational organization, you would still tackle that in very, very similar ways in terms of the actual program itself. It's just the complexity once you get down into individual organizations, you're dealing with different issues at different points. I think, there's always a resistance to change with any digital transformation project. Now, that can vary dramatically, even within a single organization via departments, right? Some people are a lot more digital savvy than others. And then if you take that and look at that from an international perspective, then that can be multiplied tenfold. You might be the first, for example, you might be the first computer system that a team has ever used, right? I mean, that's realistic. I mean, we've been working on some projects in the 90s and 2000s where that was the case, right? I mean, new communication networks were just going in and we were deploying, servers and technology, even that people had never really used before. And I think especially when you get to PCs and desktops, I think now there's a little bit more change where you can push down a lot of the user interaction to mobile phones. A lot of countries do have that, but that's pretty unique, I think. And it all comes down really, I think, communication issues. You just have to be really good in terms of the communication about what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, why it benefits people, and really focus on that.
Yeah. How about you, Dean? What would you add to that?
Yeah, just to add on what Aaron was saying about being digital savvy, and that needs to come across the entire multinational entities. And that's a big issue, is the level of digital literacy that all of the users or the power users and the management has across the company. Because if you're implementing a consolidated and integrated system, a common consolidated integrated system across the organization, I mean, everyone needs to have a minimum level of sensitivity and awareness of what information is, right? They need to be sensitive to that. They need to understand the value of having data in front of them and how they can use data to help them better, manage their operations, basically, to better plan. So that's one area. It's the being sensitive and having that digital awareness or that information awareness. And then second piece is being to know the best practices, that systems do offer. We've come across manufacturing organizations where they never built a bomb, right? They didn't know what a bomb bill of material was, for example. So you had to go and taking what Aaron was saying about communication, is you got to understand what they don't know first, and then you work your way backwards to give them the tools or the understanding of what are those simple building blocks, but extremely important building blocks when you set up and configure a system, because you can't you're not going to be using and leveraging the system if the organization doesn't understand some of these best practices, whether it's a bill of materials, whether it's setting up cost centers, for example, right, or a costing bomb, or different planning levels, and so forth. So that needs to come across, and everyone needs to be on the same page.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, there's a school of thought in the technology space where we don't need to worry about our current state. We just need to worry about our future state, and define our best practices that we're going to use in the future state. But I think what you're both saying is, yes, we need that future state. Don't ignore it, but you also can't ignore the current state, which is this is where we are today. And each location is going to have a different level of maturity, as you guys mentioned, a different skill set, a different culture, and a different way of operating. And this is especially true if you're moving to more of a common standard operating model across the country or across the world. That's going to put even more pressure on understanding the current state of each of these different locations. So those are great points. I want to turn to the audience too. We've had more people chime in on where they're joining from today. I want to say hello to Jay's Reef from Toronto on LinkedIn. Another Craig is also from Johannesburg, South Africa. So their ears must have been ringing, Aaron, when they heard us talking about South Africa. We've a few people from South Africa here. Rana from Dubai, Mecklin from the Third Stage Consulting Team in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being here, Mecklin. Darian's joining LinkedIn from Denver. And then Yeshwant is joining from Bangalore. So thank you for everyone chiming in on where you're joining from today. Sandra is joining from Chicago on YouTube. Thanks for being here. Here's a question I want to get to. Or actually, I'm going to pull up a comment and then a question from the audience here. Bear with me. I just lost it. No, where'd it go? All right, I'll come back to that comment I was going to pull up. But here's a question from Dan on YouTube. Dan says, when doing multinational ERP implementations, how important are localizations such as US GAAP and Brazilian tax? And those are two, very specific regulatory localizations. But maybe I'll broaden it a little bit more, not only to talk about regulatory localization, which is, you don't have a whole lot of choices to make there. You either complying with the law or you're not. So it's a little bit more maybe easier to answer the question around regulations because you do have to localize from a regulatory perspective. But what about just localization in general? How do you navigate that balance between the organization that wants to centralize, standardize, integrate operations, become one company versus the other extreme, which is we've got different countries operating differently. They know their markets best. They've adapted their, the operations to the local markets, and let's just leave them alone and let them operate independently. I mean, those are two extremes. It's not an either or answer. Obviously, there's a whole continuum of where we might fall on that spectrum. But let's start with you, Dean. How do you navigate that whole decision around, do we standardize and integrate across the globe, or do we let each country operate independently?
Well, you need to have the localization factor there, or else the actual entity will not be able to run its day-to-day business. I think the key thing here is when we talk about standardization and process consistency, those are just as a high-level talking points, right? In order for, let's say, system implementers to get the deal done, and they think everything's going to be nice and rosy at the end of the day when we turn the system on, but it never really happens like that. We need to keep in mind of that localization. And you were mentioning before about the as-is or the current state. That's extremely, extremely important to note that. And we can't just think about what should be the utopical way of doing business, because you have to look at that localized requirements. The key thing here is to identify what are those key data points that needs to be part of the, let's say, the regional planning process, the reporting process, and then next level would be the global reporting or planning piece. So you need to build your processes in order for companies to run their everyday business based on local regulations, but it's identifying those data points in your design so all the information can be rolled up or rolled down to the different entities.
Right. Yeah, that makes total sense. How about you, Aaron? What would you add to that?
Yeah, I think I think, you know, tying in with what Dean said, one of the key things that I've seen is really it's deciding what you actually want from the project, right? At the very start in the strategic alignment workshops up front, what are the goals? Are you trying to get standardized reporting by country, by department, by whatever? And then really understanding as best you can the balance between pain and process, right? I mean, if you go down and fix the process for a multinational organization outside of purely legal requirements in each one, you will go through a lot of pain getting that system accepted in all of your different areas. Now, if you have a completely custom solution, as Dean kind of indicated, you're not going to meet the goals of the project, right? So it's finding the balance between purely custom and very rigid in the implementation and the processes that are put down, finding the right balance there. And what that really is why are you doing this project, right? I mean, what are the goals of this project and what am I trying to see? If it's process optimization across supply chain, for example, does that vary? Do you have separate KPIs in your different countries versus at the head office? And how does that translate into the actual system that you're going to deploy for the end users? And really, I think, you know, having done a number of these, a lot of it comes down to the individual organizations, right? They have to decide what do I want out of this project? How much pain am I going to go through and bear in order to get the end results? Or how much am I focusing on let's do what's right for each individual department or each individual country, and then we'll deal with a lot of the consolidation of data and cleansing and things at a higher level and be able to pull that out. And so really it's an individual balance, I think, between the companies in terms of the strategic direction and then the local impacts and where in the balance that line gets drawn between those two things.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Here's a couple interesting comments. This is the comment I was trying to find earlier that I lost. This is from Sid on LinkedIn. Sid says, great point regarding holidays. In certain Gulf countries, the workday is Sunday through Thursday. And that's just a great example of how you can get misaligned culturally if you're not mindful of the fact that, okay, our core team might be operating Monday through Friday, but we have operations that are in the Gulf region, for example, that are operating Sunday through Thursday. There's different holiday schedules, different, religious observations and holidays and things. So just being mindful of that stuff and understanding that half the time that's half the battle, is just being aware of the differences and trying to accommodate the best you can while you're going through these projects. Because you also have to think, if you're doing a global project, there's already going to be a perception, for better or for worse, there's already going to be a perception that the global team is pushing and forcing changes that local operations may not want. So if you add to the fact that now you don't understand that they work Sunday through Thursday instead of Monday through Friday, or that they have certain holidays that you don't observe, in your country, that lack of understanding just creates a greater divide and a greater perception that you don't understand our local operations. Therefore, I'm going to resist the change that you're trying to force on me, here at the local level.
Yeah. And I think that's really a key point, right? For me, especially when I first started working on these projects, there's a lot of additional ways that you can mess things up. I think that's the thing, right? It's like you can accidentally put your foot in something that's very serious for another culture that you had no knowledge about whatsoever. And I think it's really important for the project team and the project leadership to understand the different variances and the different localities and the different cultures there, and be very respectful of those, especially if, like you say, things are getting pushed down from the head office, or the global team is in the global headquarters as opposed to in some of the local distribution centers, for example.
Yeah. And also, you look at, there's other things too, like certain cultures are just more hierarchical and more authority based versus other cultures and other countries. Like in America, for example, in the US, I mean, we value flat organizational structures and decentralization and flexibility and that sort of thing. That's great. Nothing wrong with that. But you go to other cultures and that's not the priority. And so you can't impose your own values in terms of, well, this works in the US and this is what we value, so we're just going to run the whole project like a US, like a US company. You can't do that in that example if you want to be successful.
Yeah. And even some very simple examples, right? I mean, working on some South American SI projects that I worked on, the culture for the organization that we were working with was they would not physically sign any requirements documents. And this was back in the day before we were using Agile, probably late 90s. And they would not physically sign them, which meant in our process terms, as far as what the SI was authorized moving on to the next phase, you couldn't actually move to the next phase unless the customer signed off on the documents, because you were exposing the company to too much risk. And so, that ended up in a very large negotiation and agreement that as long as we said everything was okay, but nobody had to physically sign the document itself, then we could move on. But it was very different even for the implementation team to be dealing with that kind of thing. And it's just a little thing, but it's very cultural, and some things are very embedded in how organizations operate.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Here's a question I have for you, Dean. This is from Alcinda on LinkedIn. She always has really good questions. So thank you again for this question, Alcinda. But this is coming back to that readiness concept that you were talking about a little bit earlier, Dean. But should the digital readiness assessments be done per country or centrally? And I think there's a lot to this question, because it's not just about digital readiness assessments. It's about how you make a lot of decisions. Do you do it centrally, or do you make decisions or get involvement and input from the local countries? But in the case of digital readiness assessments, do you do that per country or centrally? Do you have an opinion on that?
Well, you have to do it both. It could start with the central side in order to develop, how the company wants to operate, moving forward with this new implementation, with this new system, and get the requirements, the high-level requirements from the executive team of what they're expecting from that solution, what they're expecting from the different entities, what they're expecting from the different management tiers in the organization, on how they need to process information. But then going back to local side, it's very important to do an assessment of the current state. And one of the things that we do at third stage is what we call gap analysis, right? So a gap analysis is understanding what the executive or the global team is looking for, and understanding how the entities are currently operating, and define that gap, and then you can start building out what should be your process re-engineering activities in order to align expectations. So it does start with a central vision, I would say, of requirements. It's all about setting up requirements at the end of the day. Right. You have high-level requirements. They need to be filtered down into actual process and information requirements. And then you have localized requirements. Those also need to be developed and laid out in terms of a process and information flow and organizational flow. So all of those two levels need to combine and make sense. And at the end, you need to have sign-off from the central team.
Right. Now, here's sort of building on what you just said, Dean. I'm going to ask you this question, Aaron. This is from Craig on LinkedIn in South Africa. And Craig asks a really good question. And I think a lot of people in this meeting or in this listening to this podcast are probably wondering the same thing. But this is from Craig on LinkedIn. He says, many clients and countries believe that they are unique, but often the same process can be implemented. How do you deal with these situations? That's a big question, Aaron, but I'll start with you to see what your thoughts are.
As simply as possible. I think, a lot of it is it really is change in communication, right? And bringing people along. Sometimes if they are actually using the same process, or they can use the same process, you can get them there without the realization that the local organization is actually agreeing with the head office or how things were going to be anyway, right? I think a lot of times it's very important to make sure the local team feels part of the process. And if you as a consultant can see that there's a lot of similarities between the processes for different departments or organizations or countries, then it's in your best interests to help them along the journey so that they feel like they got there themselves. I think if you come in with the approach of just, hey, this is how we're doing things, this is what's going to be good for the company as a whole, you can lose a lot of local talent and local project team members with that approach. So really, being smart and aware of where you're trying to get to, and helping the team get to some place that is right for both them and the overall organization. I don't think there's a nice, easy cookie cutter answer to be able to get people there, but it really is paying attention to the needs and wants of the local teams and trying to get them to a good place that meets the overall project and program objectives.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's all about perspective, right? And you have to give everyone a voice. You don't want to impose a certain way of doing things, but it's about articulating how they're currently doing it and showing it in a similar way, but it's really what they're saying, right? You're saying this, I'm showing it to you right here, and we're just doing a few adjustments here and there in order to validate what the central, group wants. But really, at the end of the day, it's your process, because everything that we're translating, whether it's in a process design, in terms of a flow chart, or it's really their operation. So it's just really translating it in a different way so everyone can understand.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting that something you guys are alluding to is that sometimes it's perception. So much of this that we're talking about is perception. If the people perceive that you are forcing or imposing a change on them, especially if it's coming from another country, a lot of times that resistance is greater than if we said, let's forget about the fact that this idea originated in the US or in the UK, and now we're trying to force Saudi Arabia to adapt the same process. If you sort of depersonalize and say it's not about like the US or the UK or Saudi Arabia, it's about us as a company. This is what we're trying to accomplish as an organization, and here's how this local office is able to do that. And it becomes less personal, I guess you'd say. It's less, you're magnifying less of the cultural difference and focusing more on the commonalities, the objectives of the organization, and what we're trying to get at. So that's an interesting point you guys bring up. Sort of related to this, maybe a little bit more on the technical side, what we were just talking about the localization piece of it, is when you look at systems. This is a question from Rana on LinkedIn. And Rana says, sometimes organizations are using more advanced but disintegrated apps. It presents a great deal to implement an integrated ERP, but with somewhat lesser or complex functionality. How do you cope with these issues? And maybe another way to frame this would be to say, a lot of times the local office may have an app that they've installed just for them that's perfectly aligned with what they want, what they need. And now all of a sudden they're being asked to adapt or adopt to a more common global ERP system that may not have all the strength of functionality that they had grown accustomed to in the local market. So how do you find that balance between these disintegrated apps, these localized apps, and the possibility of an integrated solution across? Why don't we start with you, Dean?
Having different systems is not a bad thing, in different systems, in different countries, different locations. But the key thing is the governance part of it, on top of it, because we're talking about the topic is about running a digital transformation for multinational companies. So there needs to be a governing party, like a head of technology or head of information that is aware and has inventory of those applications and how are they connected, and what is the information being pushed in or pushed out from these apps, and understanding the key functionalities that reside in these applications, because they do provide value to the organization. Now it's just a question of understanding clearly what these functionalities. So it's about translating the application, just the technology, to functionalities, and how can those functionalities now be embedded in a more, integrated ERP solution. So you need to have that governance piece, and a governing party needs to be aware of the functionalities that these apps play, and they need to sign off on it.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's key, right? I think a lot of whether the apps stay or go really is defined by the overall goals of the project and your data governance, right? And will your applications fit in with the data standards that the new system will do is probably one of the first questions. And if it will, then it's down to, total cost of ownership type values and pros and cons of whether you leave it or whether you don't. But a multinational will probably have very standardized and set processes around that and what it takes to allow an individual application to kind of be there that's company specific versus the international one. But then getting that ERP, if it is decided that it's going to be replaced, then really those are the hard change management problems, right? I mean, especially if applications are loved by their users, it really is a full-time job to ensure that you do bring them along with the change and they are productive and we can get the system successfully deployed, and you want them part of that process to get them to where as close to where they want to be as possible, both from a technology and a change management point of view.
Yeah.
And just going back to a question before about localization or central. So it's all about understanding those apps. What functionalities do they perform? Are they a localized functionality? Well, we sort of need to keep it because it's doing the job. But if it's not a localized functionality, then that we need to look at how that could be embedded into more of the general process of the ERP.
Yeah. I mean, who knows? Maybe that local function, that local app could be something that could be used more widespread even outside of that location. I mean, that's the other thing. A lot of times by understanding the current state, you pick up on these nuggets of strengths and competencies and competitive advantages that local markets have developed. And a lot of times organizations ignore that and say, well, we're just going to put it in a common operating model without considering the fact that, well, maybe the way they're doing it there locally is better. Or maybe that's something we could apply in other parts of the world as well. So finding that balance is certainly tricky. A couple other comments here from the audience. This is from Eduardo. Dean, you might like this one just because you're so focused on phase 0 and planning. But Eduardo shares with us a quote. I don't know if the quote's from him or from someone else, but it's a good quote. And the quote is, "Preparing the soil is necessary before seeding change. Otherwise, no change will ever happen." It's a great quote. I'm going to give you credit for that, Eduardo, unless you tell me there's someone else that came up with that. But I like that quote. That's a good one. Here's a comment from Dan on YouTube. Great rephrasing of the questions and answers. Like the comment, balance between pain and process. So Dan's that point resonated there with Dan. And here's a question for you, Aaron. This is from Craig on YouTube. We haven't touched on this yet, but when we look at things related to data retention, et cetera, I want to get to this point here. And Craig's question is, what are the considerations around data retention, data boundaries, storage, et cetera? And presumably we're talking about on a global project. How is that different than how you might address data retention, data boundaries, storage, et cetera, on a domestic project?
I think it's a great question. There's a lot of implications around that. Data does need to be treated differently. Even if you look at now some of the requirements, if you're working in the EU compared to the US, right? You run across data retention and data access issues that are legal issues that have to be dealt with. So it's very important to understand what the requirements are at various different locations and for various different countries, because they can have a huge impact on your strategies of how you actually deal with things in a large ERP. I think, I've seen, looking at it a few different ways, you really need a centralized data governance framework. I mean, we've talked about governance, and data is a key part of that, right? And getting your data standardized as much as possible across the organization. I think that's another key. And then where it isn't standardized, or where information does have to kind of exchange between systems or countries, just making sure that you have data integration and interop kind of designed and very consciously implemented, so that you don't run into issues later on in the project. And then really, I think probably the final, outside of the overall quality and having a plan for how you're going to manage the quality, is getting back to the life cycle requirements and making sure that, yes, if you do have retention policies that are different, that they are implemented and can be implemented on a local basis. But you really just, again, it's another facet of the complexity of multinational organizations, where you will be dealing with different requirements. There is an inability to standardize data retention requirements across a whole organization that's operating in, I don't know, 50 or 100 countries. I don't believe that's possible. just based on all of the requirements I've seen in my past. So you just have to recognize where you will allow customization or localization. And again, it goes back to making conscious decisions. What you really don't want in a program is for things to accidentally happen, because there's a 50-50 chance that accident might be good or bad, right? And sometimes the odds are a little bit different than that. And really, the whole point of doing a large digital transformation, you really want to get the benefits of that. And in order to get the benefits, you really need to plan and actively manage and govern the project and the end results so that you do see your ROI.
Yeah. Makes sense. How about you, Dean? Anything you'd add to that as far as the data storage, security, some of these more technical infrastructure components of multinational deployments?
Well, I'll just piggyback on what Aaron is saying about the planning of the data. I think the rollout strategy that the multinational company set up, because such a big company, such a big project or big program, you can't have a big bang. You'll have different phases, multiple phases in different locations. So the first thing is in your phases, you need to identify what are the data requirements required in each phase, and making sure that there's a closed loop management process set up in the data that you're going to use. So you're going to get the benefits from every phase of every implementation. For example, if we're just implementing sales, it's not going to give you anything, because that's all you're not linking other departments, other processes together with an end-to-end view. So it's really setting up your rollout strategy, identifying your phases, identifying what are the key data sets required in that phase and in each phase, and how does that data set flow throughout the process you want to implement, and then you'll get the value from every step of your implementation.
Yeah. Yep. It's well said and good advice. One thing before I get to my next question here, I want to share one thing with the audience. If you like this topic of multinational implementations, which I assume you might be interested in it if you're here watching it here today, but let's just assume you are interested in this topic. I'm going to flash a QR code on the screen in front of you for those of you watching it on video here today. And it's a registration link to our upcoming conference. It's a digital transformation conference that we're hosting in October in downtown Denver, Colorado. So you can join in person or you can join remotely, virtually with a virtual pass. But we're doing a conference. The three of us will be there to talk about this and other topics related to digital transformation. So if you are interested in learning more and diving deeper with speakers from Third Stage Consulting, as well as other industry experts, we're going to have a couple dozen speakers, great entertainment. It's a 3-day event, downtown Denver. If you're able to join in person, or you can join remotely, scan the QR code in front of you and you can learn more about the agenda and the pricing and all that stuff. So we'd love to see you there. So I'm going to leave that QR code up for the rest of the conversation here today while I get to some of these other questions as we're going here. So a question I have here for you guys is that we haven't really gotten to yet is in a case study. And I'll start with you, Dean. Maybe you could give us a case study here. Could you give us an example of a successful multinational digital transformation, and maybe what was it, or what were the things that made it successful in your experience?
Right. So I'll give you the example of, let's say, a manufacturing organizations with over 30 manufacturing sites across, let's say, a dozen different countries. I think the key thing, number one, is you need to have a centralized technology implementation team. Number one, that's overseeing the whole global rollout, and ensuring the right best practices, the right consistency, the right standardization, and the right data requirements are being rolled out in each of the locations. So you need to set that team up very importantly. The next piece is, let's say in the manufacturing organization, we're talking about manufacturing, or we're talking about planning, right? So there's a lot of things to plan. You have financial planning, you have material planning, you have manufacturing planning, you have distribution planning. All those planning cycles, where are they going to sit in the organization. Are you going to because that's why you want to integrate an integrated system, because you want to integrate and centralize certain planning processes. Instead of having 3 different sites doing their own planning, it will be centralized versus one regional, let's say, planning office, and they would be giving the plans, the material plans, the manufacturing plans, the distribution plans to perform the execution. So it's important to set up your centralized planning offices as well, not just implementing the technology, because they're the ones who are going to be receiving information, the data information of what's happening on the floor, and then they're going to replan for the next planning schedule, and also they're going to give the new plan or the next plan for the next cycle to the execution teams. So I would say that's extremely important. So 2 is to have that IT information team being centralized with their own team of business analysts. That's essential. That's part of that central team, and then they're setting up the processes and the configuration requirements for those locations, and setting up those centralized planning offices in order to use the system properly.
Right. What about you, Aaron? What are some of the most critical lessons you've learned from being involved with multinational digital transformation projects? Like, how would you summarize some of the lessons learned? Or
honestly, I think, where I've seen companies do exceptionally well has been the deliberate focus on communication. And by communication, that's not just one way, right? It's 2 way. It's when there is enough knowledge passed down to the rest of the organization to let them know about what the project, what's going on with the project, why it's happening. And then also making sure, like we talked about, right, you're taking the understanding of the different localities and how that impacts their work and how that impacts the project, and allowing that communication back to be acted on. I think, deliberate planning of communication can really make a big difference, and being very proactive and getting out there in front. And I think what I've seen as well, one of the, you always assume good communication is really going to help with change management. Where I was pleasantly surprised is it can also help you step up on the execution side of the project for the internal teams, and the communication between, the technical and the business teams, or the deployment team and the development team. Even right the way across the organization, communication just has such a large impact on the success of the project when you do it right.
Right. Yeah, makes total sense. Now, Gene, how have you found it to be most relevant to measure the success of a digital transformation project in a multinational setting, and how might that be different than how you'd measure digital transformation success for a localized or a domestic project? Or is it different?
Well, it's just a scale that's really different. I mean, the success is really, you have less people running around looking for information.
Right.
I mean, that's, at the end of the day, that's what the companies are looking for. Reducing all those non-value added activities to look for information, to cleanse information, to export information into Excels, and then cleanse that out and put it back in and set the plan out. So it's that's really the success factor. And multinational is about that planning and reporting piece. Those are the 2 requirements of why a global ERP is required. So planning needs to be done seamlessly, hopefully, within a centralized solution with all the data parameters, and planners can do their job and just to plan and to replan and to mitigate the risk, instead of looking for information and sending emails. I need this by this time. I need this by this time because I have to send my plan next week. And then the reporting, reports are generated properly. So all of that data flow that we're talking about earlier, that closed loop system of an end-to-end process of how data needs to flow, that needs to be if that's reached, your company's going to get a lot of value out of their investment.
Yeah, makes sense. Anything you'd add to that, Aaron, as far as how to measure success on these multinational initiatives?
Yeah, I think typically being involved in the front end and on the strategy side, it's important to define what the KPIs are that you're going to measure success before you get to the end, right? So everybody understands those. So I don't think that is necessarily any difference. Where I have seen difference is in which KPIs you actually measure on the multinational side, right? So some of the things that we've already talked about in terms of the regulatory requirements at local countries or organizations, having KPIs not just at the national and international level, but ensuring that you are meeting the local requirements. So that's done. And then getting back to the change management, keeping track of local adoption of the system by country or by department or by organization, and having some very specific KPIs where there has been a big gap, a big jump between what the previous technology was and what the new technology is going to be, because those are some of your risk areas, right? Having a successful deployment doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a successful system for the next 5 years. You want to make sure that people continue to use that system, use it in the right way, grow that, provide feedback, and continually improve. And I think having KPIs around the adoption in the local areas gives you a good insight about how well that future process is going to be, so that you can take early action.
Yeah. Good advice there. It all comes back to the KPIs and having the right KPIs, of course. Here's a question from Darian on LinkedIn. Darian asks, how do you see the landscape of digital transformation evolving in the next 5 to 10 years for multinational companies? Why don't we start with you, Dean? That's a big question. There's a lot of directions you can go with that question, but I'll ask it anyway. How do you see the landscape of digital transformation changing in the next 5 to 10 years for multinationals?
I don't really see it changing. You just got to do things better than what that we've been doing in the past. Really, there's no
magic bullet.
There's no new magic bullet. There's no new methodology. In my view, we just got to set up the program fully and completely, and we need to list out all the moving parts and work and build out a project for each moving part. So I guess if we use technology to help manage the program, that would help, maybe, using a platform to help the management of the global rollout. That could be that could ease the overall management of all the stakeholders and all of that. So it's there's no real magic bullet. You just got to lay everything out, and it needs to fit on the wall somewhere, and you have your checklist set up, and you're checking all the boxes.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because it is easy to get caught up in AI and agile and cloud, predictive analytics, whatever, cybersecurity, all these different trends. In 5 to 10 years, there's going to be new technology trends that we don't even know about yet. So it's easy to get caught up in all that and think, okay, well, that's going to totally change how we have to do multinational implementations. But I like how simple, like you kind of simplified it. Said, well, just stop screwing up the way we've been doing projects in the past and do it better.
Stop relying on the technology to do the work for you.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, it's you need to map it out. You need to understand every crux of the project and make sure you have a plan for it, and it's linked to other elements of the project. Once you do that and you set up your end-to-end processes and they're rolling properly, then another level or another I would say layer of technology you could add is sort of like a control tower, like a process mining tool kind of thing, to see how those processes are running, to understand the length that it takes to run these processes, the queue times and stuff like that, the documents queue in that process, to see if there's ways to improve the process. But that's later on. Don't jump into that right away if you don't set up your basics, set up the basics right in the first place.
Yeah, it's good advice. So I guess just to sort of wrap this all up and tie it all together, everything we've talked about, and I'll start with you, Aaron, as kind of a closing question here. What advice would you give to companies and project teams that are about to start a multinational digital transformation, or perhaps they're early in the journey? What sort of closing advice, if you're going to leave us with 2 or 3 things that are the most important to remember, what would that be?
I think from my point of view is spend the time up front to take a deliberate approach. Like investing in the planning phase will never be money badly spent. And then I think carrying on from that really is make communication central to the program. And then thirdly, define what success looks like up front and make sure that everybody's aware of that, so everybody's marching towards the same goals.
Yeah. You have that common purpose, and we know why we're doing this project and what we're doing to support the goals of the company. Yeah. How about you, Dean? What would you add to that?
Yeah, well, implementing the technology is only at the final piece of the whole journey, really. I look at it as maybe the 80-20 rule. 80% is the whole preparation, right? It's everything, getting the whole organization aligned, having that digital strategy, setting up your data right, setting up your rollout plan, knowing what you need in terms of functional architecture and so forth. And then you do that change management and setting up your requirements. At the end, the implementation should roll smoothly if you've taken everything into account, and that's 80%. So if you think an implementation, your implementation rollout is going to take 1 year, maybe you need to spend 3 years to prepare, not 6 months. And give an analogy, it's like you're training for a marathon, and if your goal is to run a sub-3 marathon, imagine all the work and the training and the fitness that's required to run that sub-3 marathon. That sub-3 marathon is only 3 hours, but imagine the hundreds of hours of training to get to that level, to give you a chance to run under that time. And it's the same thing. The more time you put, the more fitness, the more training you put in the beginning, you're going to enjoy the process of running that marathon, and you're going to enjoy your result at the end of the day.
Yeah. Instead of thinking that if I just start the marathon now, instead of training, I'll finish it faster because I'm starting it now. And I think that's what a lot of organizations do, is they think, well, why bother with the training? Let's just start it now and then we'll get done sooner. Well, no, because you're probably going to keel over and die because you're not in condition to run a marathon. So you need to make sure you.
But we're talking about digital transformation. It's not just completing a marathon. It has to be done proper. Like you want to hit a certain target, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, good deal. Well, this is good stuff. Thanks for your guys' insights here and your time, and thank you to the audience for the great questions here. Again, if you're interested in our Digital Stratosphere Conference, right above me here on the video is a QR code you can scan. You can learn more about the event. Again, you can join us in person in the first week of October. You can join us in person in Denver, Colorado in the US, or if you're international, not able to make it to Denver, you can also join remotely and get access to all the recordings as well if you're not able to join it live. And so you can sign up for a virtual pass as well. So check out that QR code if you want to just bookmark the link and look at the agenda and whatnot. You can scan that QR code in front of you. This podcast discussion will become part of the Transformation Ground Control podcast. And if you don't listen to that podcast, you can subscribe to it and listen to past episodes and upcoming episodes by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. That's the event or the podcast page where it has all the platforms where we stream to, and you can subscribe and watch wherever you want there. So again, that's transformationgroundcontrol.com. We do these live discussions every Tuesday, same time, same place. Thanks for being here today. And Aaron and Dean, really appreciate having you here today.
Thank you for the opportunity. This has been great.
Yeah, absolutely. This is fun, and hope the audience enjoyed it. Hope the audience has a great week as well. For those of you in the U.S., hope you have a happy holiday weekend, Independence Day weekend, celebrating our independence from Aaron's people in Britain.
Technically, I am both people now, so I'm going to have an interest in 4th of July.
That's what makes it more fun to blame you, or I should be thanking you for the opportunity for us to have a holiday weekend here this weekend.
Exactly. Thanking me for your freedom.
Exactly. We owe it all to you. So just continue with that international theme there. But thank you again for joining here today. Hope you all have a great week, and we'll see you next time on the next weekly live stream. So take care. Have a great week. We'll see you soon.